the unsolved murder mystery of Elizabeth Short that still haunts Los Angeles till date. She was known as the Black Dahlia. What they found in an empty lot still haunts Los Angeles. In the quiet town of Hyde Park, Massachusetts, on the morning of July 29, 1994, a third daughter was born to Cleo and Phoebe Short. They named her Elizabeth, and she joined her sisters, Eleanor and Dorothy, in a small family home. The Shorts were a working-class family. Her father was skilled at building miniature golf courses, and her mother cared for the children and kept the household together. In the late 1920s, life in America was changing fast. The economic boom after World War I was giving way to the dark shadow of the Great Depression, and when the stock market collapsed in 1929, the ripple hit small towns just as hard as big cities. Cleo Short lost his work. The miniature golf craze dried up almost overnight, and with it went his income and pride. Money became scarce. Arguments grew frequent, and the stress of keeping a roof over their heads took its toll. One morning, when Elizabeth was still very young, her father vanished. He left his car abandoned near a bridge, leading everyone to believe he had taken his own life. Phoebe was left to raise the children alone, on a bookkeeper's salary, working long hours to keep food on the table. Elizabeth's early years were shaped by the lessons of scarcity and resilience. From a young age, she was delicate in health. She suffered from bronchitis and mild asthma. The cold New England winters were harsh on her breathing, so doctors advised that she spend winters somewhere warmer. And in her early teens, she was sent to stay with family friends in Miami, Florida for months. At a time there, she found a love for the sun, the open skies, and the lighter mood of a place untouched by snow. These early seasonal migrations planted in her a desire to someday live where the weather was always kind to her lungs and her spirit. As she grew into her teenage years, she became striking. Her skin was pale, almost porcelain, her hair a deep shade of brown, her eyes an unusual green that seemed to shift in the light. She was quiet, but had a certain grace about her. Neighbors said she walked as though she knew. Eyes were on her, not in vanity, but in some quiet awareness. She began to dream about life beyond the confines of Hyde Park, perhaps in the movies, perhaps in some faraway city, where she could reinvent herself. Later on, a letter arrived that would change everything about Cleo Short. Her father, the man presumed dead, was alive. He had been living in California, working in the shipyards of San Francisco. The letter was not an apology. It was more of a statement that he was still in the world and making a life for himself without his family. The revelation hit Elizabeth in ways she didn't express outwardly.
She was 18, now old enough to make choices for herself, and the thought of California, with its warm climate and golden possibilities, pulled at her. In 1943, she packed what little she owned and traveled west to live with him. But the reunion was nothing like she had imagined. He was critical of her. He found her too independent, too focused on glamorous dreams. They clashed over small things and large ones. He disapproved of her spending habits, her interest in nightlife, and her way of dressing. After a short time, the strain became too much, and she left his home, determined to survive on her own terms. She drifted between jobs, waitressing, selling tickets at theaters occasionally, finding work as an extra in films. She rented small rooms in Los Angeles and Santa Barbara, living paycheck to paycheck, yet always presenting herself as though she belonged to a higher world. Her clothes were carefully chosen, her makeup precise. She was known for wearing sheer black dresses and tailored skirts that hinted at elegance even if they were secondhand. She attracted men easily, but seemed to float from one relationship to another, never settling long. Friends recalled that she often spoke of wanting to marry and have children, but she also longed for a break into the entertainment world. She believed in the power of appearances and carried herself like someone already half famous. She enjoyed the company of servicemen. During the war years, she attended dances and parties and was photographed often. her image beginning to resemble the femme fatale look of Hollywood's noir era. By the mid-1940s, she was a familiar face in certain circles of Los Angeles, particularly among young hopefuls, who mingled with producers and actors at bars and hotel lobbies. She had a way of inserting herself into conversations of opportunity, without seeming pushy. But the reality was her dreams were still far from reach, and her bank account rarely held more than a few dollars at a time. The war had ended and the city was in a state of restless optimism. The streets were alive with neon signs, and the steady hum of cars. The Hollywood Hills glowed at night like a promise in the distance. But underneath, the glitter crime was rising. Transient populations brought in by the film industry mingled with darker elements. The contrast between beauty and danger was sharp, and it was in this mix that Elizabeth Short was building her life. The choices she made in those days were leading her toward an intersection of fate and danger, though she could not have known it. Each new acquaintance, each late night out, each ride offered by a stranger or a casual friend, was another thread weaving toward a tragic end. And as we step closer into her story, we begin to see how one woman's ambition for a better life in the City of Angels would collide with the darkest forces lurking beneath its sunny skies. After leaving her father's home, Elizabeth found herself living in a pattern that many young women in Los Angeles knew well, moving between short-term rentals, cheap hotel rooms and shared apartments. When the rent became too much, she would pack her belongings into a small suitcase and head somewhere new. Her network of friends was wide but shallow. Bartenders, waitresses, servicemen passing through a handful of aspiring actors like herself. She was rarely alone, but she was often lonely. One of the men she grew close to was Lieutenant Gordon Fickling, a young Army Air Corps officer. They wrote letters back and forth for months. She signed them Beth and often filled them with details about her days in the city. Her tone in the letters revealed a mix of optimism and restlessness. She spoke about the small victories like getting a new dress or attending a film premiere, and the disappointments of jobs falling through. Fickling recalled years later that she had a way of making even ordinary moments sound like part of a bigger adventure. But he also sensed she was always searching for something she couldn't quite name. By 1946, the war was over and many servicemen returned home. Some married sweethearts. Others left behind wartime romances that faded quickly. Elizabeth kept drifting. She spent some time in San Diego staying with a friend named Dorothy French, who found her sleeping in the movie theater where Dorothy worked. Elizabeth explained she had nowhere else to go, so Dorothy offered her a place to stay for a few weeks. Weeks turned into months. Dorothy described her as polite, soft-spoken, and neat, but also noted that she stayed out late most nights and rarely spoke about where she went. It was during this period that she earned the nickname Black Dahlia. The name came from the film The Blue Dahlia, which had been released the year before, starring Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake. It was a noir thriller involving crime and betrayal. The black part of her nickname was a nod to her preference for black clothing, sheer dresses, and tailored black suits. That set her apart in public. Her striking look and mysterious aura fed into the urban legend. She was both approachable and untouchable, a paradox that drew attention everywhere she went. Despite her carefully crafted image, her life behind the scenes was unstable. She had no steady job and often relied on the generosity of men she met for dinner's rides or help with rent. Some of these connections were harmless, fleeting acquaintances. Others may have been dangerous, though at the time she didn't see them that way. She trusted easily, perhaps too easily, and the city was full of people who were willing to take advantage of someone like her. In the fall of 1946, she reconnected with Lieutenant Fickling, though the relationship never became serious. She also began spending time with a man named Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner whose connections in Hollywood ran deep. Hansen later told police he had offered her a place to stay, and even tried to help her find work as an actress. but claimed she drifted away from him by choice. As December approached, Elizabeth's path grew more uncertain. She was seen in various parts of Los Angeles, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. Police records and witness statements from later would place her in cafes, hotels, and bars scattered across the city. She was described as calm and polite, yet seemed to carry an undercurrent of worry. Though she never voiced it openly, she still wrote letters to a few close friends hinting that she hoped for something better to come along. Around the start of January 1947, she was staying at the home of a woman named Ann Tuttle in San Diego, but told friends she planned to travel north back to Los Angeles. Her movements during the first 2 weeks of that year would later become the subject of intense investigation. The days leading up to her disappearance are a web of partially confirmed sightings and speculation. Some witnesses claim to have seen her at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles on the evening of January 9th. She was reportedly waiting in the lobby, possibly for someone to meet her. The Biltmore was known as a fashionable meeting place with its high ceilings and ornate decor. It was a place where deals were made both legitimate and otherwise. From that night forward, no confirmed sightings exist that place her alive again, though unverified accounts would trickle in over the years. Friends and acquaintances who were later interviewed each had their own theory about what might have happened. Some believed she left the hotel with someone she knew. Others thought she may have accepted a ride from a stranger. Still others speculated she had been lured to a meeting under false pretenses. What was clear even then was that she had little money, no fixed address, and no close family nearby. She was vulnerable in ways she may not have realized, and the city could be merciless to those without a safety net. Throughout this time, she continued to dress elegantly, even when her circumstances were far from glamorous. Waitresses at cafes remembered her ordering coffee and toast with a polite smile, sometimes leaving without finishing her meal as though her mind was elsewhere. It was this contrast between her appearance and her reality that fascinated people later. How a young woman could maintain such poise and beauty while her life was balanced on a razor's edge. As the days passed and she failed to contact friends, some began to wonder where she had gone. But in a transient city, it was not unusual for someone to vanish for a week or two, and then reappear with a story of traveling to another part of the state. Few could have imagined the truth that would soon come to light. The stage was set, though the players were still in shadow. Elizabeth's short story was about to turn from the quiet struggles of a young woman chasing dreams into one of the most infamous unsolved murder cases in American history, and the events of the coming days would ensure her name would never be forgotten. On January 9, 1947, a Wednesday night, the last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short took place at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. The building was grand, even then, its marble floors and gilded ceilings echoing with the footsteps of businessmen, tourists, and the occasional Hollywood hopeful she had been seen speaking with a man near the lobby. Some accounts describe him as well-dressed, older, with a confident air. Others could not recall much at all except that she seemed calm and expectant, as if waiting for something or someone. What happened after that moment remains one of the enduring mysteries of the case. Some believe she left the Biltmore with this man. Others think she stepped out alone to hail a taxi or meet another contact in the neighborhood. She had been known to move easily between different social circles, often shifting her demeanor to fit the people she was with. In one evening, she might be laughing in a booth at a nightclub, and the next morning quietly sipping coffee at a corner cafe. Police would later try to trace her movements in those missing days. From January 10th to January 14th, the trail was made up of faint and conflicting accounts. There were alleged sightings in Long Beach and Venice Beach. Others claimed she had been seen in a restaurant in Hollywood, and even walking along a quiet street in San Marino. None of these were ever confirmed in every version of the story. She was alone or with someone unidentified. It was during these days that the city's winter air hung heavy. with fog and the glow of street lamps turned the sidewalks into pools of yellow light. Los Angeles was between storms, the dampness, lingering just enough to chill the air at night in the bus stations and hotel lobbies. People came and went at all hours, sometimes carrying dreams, sometimes running from disappointments. For someone like Elizabeth, it was easy to become just another shadow in the crowd. There were rumors that she had been trying to reach Lieutenant Gordon Fickling again, possibly to arrange a meeting. Others suggested she was still in contact with Mark Hansen, the nightclub owner, and may have gone to see him, though he denied this. There were whispers, too, of new men in her life, names that would appear in police reports but never in courtrooms. She was a young woman navigating a city full of offers and dangers, each choice leading her closer to something she could not yet see. Friends who spoke to police later said she had been in good spirits. When last they saw her, she spoke of opportunities, maybe a small acting role or modeling work. She had met someone who claimed to know people in the industry, but those who knew Los Angeles well also knew that promises were cheap and often worthless in that business. One of the few tangible pieces of the timeline came from a woman named Gertrude Davis, who claimed she had rented a room to Elizabeth briefly around this time. She described her as pleasant but noted she left suddenly without explanation, taking her suitcase and saying she was going to meet her sister in San Diego, though no such meeting ever took place. The distance between these fragments of her final days is what has haunted investigators for decades. The gaps are wide and filled with speculation. Was she moving between safe places trying to find somewhere permanent? Or was she being moved by someone else? Each theory is shaped by the lens of the person telling it, and over time fact and legend have intertwined. By the evening of January 19th, somewhere in the city, Elizabeth was likely still alive, though no one can say with certainty where she was, or in whose company. The truth of those hours would become buried under layers of rumor, misdirection, and outright lies. In a city where news traveled fast but details often arrived warped by retelling, the fate awaiting her on January 15th would shock even the most hardened residents. The crime would not only make headlines, it would dominate them, drawing in everyone from seasoned detectives to amateur sleuths, each eager to solve the riddle of the Black Dahlia. That night somewhere in Los Angeles, the air was still damp and cool. The neon signs blinked over quiet streets. Streetcars rattled past apartment windows, and the city's restless heart beat on, unaware that in a matter of hours a discovery would turn one woman's absence into a national obsession. The night of January 14, 1947 passed without fanfare in the streets of Los Angeles. The rain from the previous days had dried. The sidewalks smelled faintly of dust, and gasoline neon signs flickered along Main Street, drawing small crowds into late-night diners and bars. The city had the quiet hum of a place between storms, but beneath the calm there was always motion, always someone moving from one place to another, and among them was Elizabeth Short, though no one knows exactly where she spent those hours or in whose company. Some investigators believe she had been with a man that evening, someone she trusted or at least felt safe enough to be near. This man, whoever he was, has never been publicly identified. Witnesses who came forward years later spoke in half-memories, vague impressions of a dark sedan or a figure standing beside her in the shadows, but nothing concrete surfaced. The uncertainty around those last moments before her disappearance has become one of the most enduring aspects of the case. There were reports from people in the Crenshaw district and around Hollywood Boulevard who swore they had seen her, a young woman with striking black hair, walking quickly as if trying to make an appointment. Some even described her laughing in the company of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat, but no one could give a name. No one could place the meeting with certainty. At some point in the small hours of January 15th, her fate shifted from movement to stillness. What transpired between that time and the moment her body was found remains unknown to this day. There were theories of a private residence somewhere, secluded, perhaps a rented house or apartment away from the city center. There were whispers of a gathering gone wrong, of an argument that escalated, of a meeting that was never meant to let her walk away. Police files from the time contain notes that hint at suspects known to be violent, known to carry grudges and known to keep secrets. The morning of January 15th began like any other. For the residents of Limit Park, a quiet neighborhood in South Los Angeles, houses with trimmed lawns sat under a pale winter sky. Children walked to school. Mothers hung laundry in backyards. The air was still and cool. Around 10 in the morning, a woman named Betty Bersinger left her home with her 3-year-old daughter. She was walking along Norton Avenue when something caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a broken store mannequin lying in the grass beside the sidewalk, pale and unmoving. The sight was strange but not immediately alarming. As she drew closer, the image sharpened into something far more horrific. The figure was not a mannequin, it was the naked body of a young woman, cut in two at the waist, the halves placed a short distance apart. The skin was a stark white, almost luminous in the morning light. The face had been cut from the corners of the mouth to the ears in a grim frozen smile. Her dark hair fanned out around her head like a halo in the dirt. Betty grabbed her daughter and ran to a nearby house, where she called the police. The call came in at 10:50 a.m. within Minute Squad. Cars were on the scene. Officers quickly confirmed that this was no accident, no ordinary crime. The area was cordoned off, though by then a few neighbors had already seen enough to carry the story into the neighborhood. By noon, the block was crowded with uniformed officers, detectives, reporters, and curious onlookers. The body was posed deliberately, the hands above the head, the legs spread apart. There were no clothes, no purse, no identification. Marks in the dirt suggested the body had been placed there, rather than killed on sight. A faint trail of bloody footprints led toward the street but ended abruptly. Perhaps the killer had worn gloves or covered his shoes. Perhaps he had been careful enough to erase his steps. Detectives from the Los Angeles Police Department's Homicide Division arrived and began working. The scene captain, Jack Donahoe, one of the lead investigators, described it as the most brutal and calculated crime he had seen in his career. Crime scene photographers documented every angle while officers canvassed the neighborhood for witnesses. Some residents claimed to have seen a dark car parked on Norton Avenue in the early morning hours. Others recalled hearing a dog barking furiously around 3 a.m. The body was taken to the county morgue, where the coroner began his examination almost immediately. He estimated the woman had been dead for about 10 hours, meaning she was likely killed sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of head trauma and blood loss. The cuts to her face had been made after death. The body had been drained of blood and washed clean before being placed at the scene. Fingerprints taken from the corpse were rushed to the FBI's Identification Division. Using a Y-photo transmission system, within hours they had a match. The victim was 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, known to some as the Black Dahlia. News of the identification reached the press almost as quickly as it reached the police. By the next morning, her name and face were on the front page of every major newspaper in Los Angeles. Her life, which had been a private struggle, and a series of small personal connections, was now public property. Every detail of her movements, relationships, and letters would be dissected for clues. And every person who had crossed her path in the previous months would be considered a potential suspect. By the afternoon, the murder of Elizabeth Short had become the dominant headline in Los Angeles. The details of the crime were too unusual, too gruesome for the public to ignore. Her name was printed in bold type, alongside the words "tortured, mutilated body found in vacant lot." Newspapers scrambled to gather every fact they could, even if those facts were thin or based on rumor. Detectives knew from the start that the killer had not acted in a moment of rage. This was a deliberate act performed with precision. The cutting of the body, the complete drainage of blood, the washing and posing at the scene. These were details that suggested planning time, privacy, and skill. Some even speculated the murderer might have been trained in surgery or anatomy, though others argued the cuts were rough enough to come from someone with only basic knowledge. The split opinion on this point would continue for decades. Captain Jack Donahoe assigned a large team to the case, among them detectives Harry Hansen and Finis Brown, who would become two of the most recognized names in connection with the investigation. They began by interviewing everyone who had known Elizabeth in the weeks before her death. Nightclub owners, bartenders, hotel clerks, bus station attendants, anyone who might have seen her or spoken to her. They collected descriptions of men she had been with, though the stories were inconsistent. Some described a man in his 40s with dark hair. Others mentioned someone younger, thin, with a nervous manner. Police files grew thick with lists of potential suspects and witnesses. Within days, the number of people questioned had climbed into the hundreds. It seemed as though anyone who had ever spoken to Elizabeth was brought in for questioning. Several were given lie detector tests, a procedure still new and unreliable at the time. The pressure to solve the case quickly was immense. Newspapers ran editorials criticizing the police department for not having answers by the end of the first week. The media frenzy reached a new level when an anonymous caller phoned the office of the Los Angeles Examiner. Claiming to be the killer, the voice was calm, deliberate. He congratulated the editor on the coverage so far, and promised to send items belonging to the victim. 3 days later, a manila envelope arrived at the Examiner office, the address written with letters cut from newspaper headlines. Inside were personal belongings of Elizabeth Short, including her birth certificate, business cards, photographs, and an address book, all wiped clean of fingerprints. The police confirmed the items were indeed hers. This contact with the press shifted the tone of the investigation. Now it was not just a hunt for a killer, but a cat and mouse game between the murderer and the authorities. The killer seemed to enjoy the attention, feeding the public's fascination and the detectives' frustration. Leads poured in from across the city and even from out of state. Some were from people convinced they had seen Elizabeth in the days before her death. Others were confessions from individuals who turned out to have no connection to the case. Some did it for the notoriety, others because they were mentally ill. By the end of the first month, more than 60 men had confessed to the murder, each story unraveling under basic questioning. One of the early suspects was Mark Hansen, the nightclub owner, with whom Elizabeth had sometimes stayed. He admitted she had been at his home weeks earlier and that he had feelings for her, but insisted he had not seen her after she left his house. Police found no physical evidence tying him to the crime and eventually moved on. Another suspect was Robert Manley, a traveling salesman who had driven her from San Diego to Los Angeles in early January. He passed 2 lie detector tests and was cleared. Rumors swirled that the killer might be connected to organized crime, to the Hollywood underworld, or to powerful men who wanted the case buried. Some journalists claimed off the record that certain suspects were protected by influence and money, while police insisted they were following every lead without bias. The truth of how much was known and how much was hidden is still debated by historians of the case. The neighborhood where her body had been found remained under heavy patrol for weeks. Residents were questioned repeatedly, front lawns and back alleys searched for anything that might have been overlooked. A few blocks away, a vacant garage was examined after a tipster claimed to have seen blood there. Police found stains, but testing methods of the time could not definitively match them to the victim. Meanwhile, the coroner's report provided further detail. She had suffered blows to the head, causing a skull fracture. The cuts to her body were made with a sharp instrument, likely after death. There were rope marks on her wrists and ankles, suggesting she had been bound. The level of brutality pointed to deep personal rage or a sadistic compulsion. The combination of careful preparation and intense violence puzzled investigators. Most killers fit one pattern or the other, not both. The name Black Dahlia began appearing in headlines more often than her real name. For the detectives, the challenge was to keep focus amid the noise every day brought. More witnesses, more suspects, more letters from the public. Each tip had to be checked. Each lead followed, no matter how unlikely. By early February, the investigation had consumed hundreds of man-hours without bringing them closer to an arrest. The killer's taunting contact through the newspaper stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving behind only questions and a trail of speculation. As January turned to February 1947, the Black Dahlia investigation settled into a grinding pattern. The first days had been filled with urgency and expectation. Now there was only the slow accumulation of reports files and dead ends. The police had followed every promising lead into disappointment. The city that had been shocked by the brutality of the crime was still talking about it in diners and on street corners. But the certainty that the killer would be caught soon was fading. Detectives Harry Hansen and Finis Brown continued to lead the investigation. They reviewed every known associate of Elizabeth Short, every man she had spoken to in her final weeks, every place she had visited. Hansen was methodical, Brown more intuitive. Both were frustrated by the sheer number of false confessions that poured in. At one point, the count had risen to more than 60 individuals claiming responsibility. Almost all of them were quickly exposed as liars or mentally unstable. The case became a magnet for attention seekers. As weeks became months, the original investigative team began to rotate off the case. Other major crimes demanded resources, but the Black Dahlia files never stopped growing. They were stored in boxes labeled with her name, each one heavy with witness statements, photographs, and handwritten notes. Rumors continued to swirl about suspects who were never officially named. Some pointed to a doctor with a history of violence toward women. Others whispered about a man who had left the country shortly after the murder. The police never confirmed these theories, but fragments of them would later surface in books and documentaries, keeping the speculation alive for decades. In April, a new twist emerged when a note arrived at the Examiner, once again formed from newspaper clippings. It read, "Turn yourself in at once before you get more trouble." The letter was signed with a name investigators could not connect to anyone involved. It seemed to be either another taunt from the killer or a cruel joke from someone seeking attention. The envelope contained no new evidence, no belongings of the victim, and no fingerprints. It was the last direct communication linked to the case. Without fresh leads, the investigation slowed further. By the end of the year, it was officially considered a cold case, though the file remained open for follow-up on any future tips. But the Black Dahlia would not be forgotten. Her story appeared in pulp magazines, crime anthologies, and eventually television dramatizations, each retelling adding new angles or imagined details. After a while, the Los Angeles Police Department re-examined the case as part of a larger review of unsolved murders. They interviewed witnesses, now older and perhaps more willing to talk, but no breakthrough came through. The case continued to haunt both the public and retired officers who had worked it. Some of them kept personal copies of certain photographs or notes, convinced that the truth was buried somewhere in the contradictions of the witness statements. A private investigator claimed to have uncovered proof that the killer was a local businessman with ties to organized crime. His evidence was circumstantial and was dismissed by authorities, but the theory gained traction in certain circles. In the 1990s, new technology in forensic science prompted another review of the evidence. Unfortunately, many of the original items from the scene had been lost over time. Photographs and written reports remained, but physical samples that could have been tested for DNA were gone. This meant that any modern investigation would be limited to re-examining old information, rather than discovering new forensic leads. In 2003, a retired homicide detective named Steve Hodel published a book, accusing his own father, George Hodel, a prominent Los Angeles doctor, of being the killer. His argument was based on old photographs found among his father's belongings, alleged handwriting matches to the taunting letters, and a series of police surveillance reports from 1949 that placed George Hodel under suspicion for other crimes. The theory was controversial. Some investigators found it compelling, others dismissed it as speculation. The case remains officially unsolved to this day. More than 75 years later, the vacant lot where Elizabeth's body was found is now part of a quiet neighborhood. No marker notes. The location only those who know the history can point to the exact spot. Yet the legend of the Black Dahlia still draws writers, filmmakers, and amateur sleuths. Her life and death continue to raise questions about the dangers faced by young women, drawn to Hollywood's promise of fame, about the way media can shape public perception, about the thin line between truth and myth in true crime, and somewhere in those hundreds of witness statements, in those boxes of photographs and typewritten reports, there may still be the one detail, the one overlooked connection that could finally identify the person who on a cold January morning left her in that vacant lot, posed like a message to the city. For now, the City of Angels keeps a secret. But in the next case, we will see what happens when a disappearance in the California desert leaves investigators with even fewer clues. Smash that subscribe button so you don't miss the next case. Comment your thoughts and tell us what you think should have been done to solve this murder mystery.